If you go back to the Middle Ages, there were a couple of droughts that were several hundred years long in Southern California and the Eastern Sierra, where for maybe 100 years or so, there was about 40 to 60% of the average rainfall. So that's a very long drought. Essentially, it's climate change if you're living in the middle of that. We're about halfway through the wet season, and we've gotten almost no precipitation.
Right.
So we would have to have essentially double normal precipitation for the next 2 months in order to have a normal precipitation year. We're going to have some issues on the reservoirs with regard to some of the fish flows. The reservoir levels now are so low that in several cases there's a worry that we might not be able to maintain normal fish flows for the entire salmon spawning season. One of the things you would like not to do is to run out of water for the fish flows just before the eggs hatch. So it might be that on some of the streams we have to reduce some of the flows to sort of partially triage some of the fish nests, fish redds, and in order to preserve others. So I think we're going to have some really hard choices to make regarding fish flows in the reservoirs. In Australia, some years ago, not very long ago actually, less than a decade ago, they had a 12-year drought. Tremendous, terrible drought. Some of you might remember it. And several years into that drought, they figured it was a new, drier climate. And it was such a terrible drought that they figured that all the cities on the coast should build seawater desalination plants. And so they went out and made tremendous investments in building these seawater desalination plants. And then the drought ended. And they found that they had all of these very expensive desalination plants, which are also very expensive to run, that were too expensive to operate. And so now they're still having to pay off these very expensive plants. And when they have pretty adequate water supply most years now. Santa Barbara had the similar kind of a thing happen with a much shorter drought in 1991. They had a very big cutback. They said, oh, we're tired of this, we're going to go build a desalination plant. And the drought ended, and they had to mothball and eventually sold off parts of that plant. So one of the things that we have to, I think, be careful about is not to panic, not to make very large investments prematurely. I think you have to sort of follow it along as it develops. Droughts are very slow disasters, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they end abruptly. So I think most of the water utilities have a very staged approach to this. About this time, they're letting everybody know it's a dry year. They're trying to encourage people to conserve water. If the drought continues to worsen, the reservoir levels continue to decline, you'll have water agencies asking for more water conservation and more water conservation. Eventually, they'll be banning the lawn watering and things like that. About half of California's urban water use is watering outdoor lawns and landscapes. So there's a lot of water that can be saved in urban areas. It's expensive to people's nice lawns, and it's expensive if you work in the landscaping industry, but we can do it. The biggest impacts will be to the agricultural regions, agricultural towns. But agriculture, it uses about 80% of human water use in the state, but it's only responsible for about maybe 3 or 4% of statewide employment and statewide gross domestic product. So it's a terrible thing that agriculture is going to be affected so severely by drought, but it's a fortunate thing that most of California's economy, if we manage a drought well, is not nearly as sensitive to drought as agriculture. In 1991, we had a very, very dry December, January, February. People were panicking, and then they had what they called the Miracle March, which had about 3 times the normal precipitation in that 1 month. It was still a very dry year, but not the driest year of record. One of the good things about droughts is it forces policymakers and the public to better understand the water problems that the society is having, the region is having. In our case, we have a lot of ecological problems regarding water and water management. We have a lot of groundwater problems regarding water and water management. We have, being in a dry state, we have a lot of competition for water, and that will never end. We just have to try to manage it well. And a drought is a good opportunity for us to focus on what those trade-offs really are, and on what we really want out of water management as an overall society. How do we trade off different kinds of ecosystems and different kinds of economic activities and our own yards and gardens? It's very tangible to us now, whereas in a non-drought year it's all kind of abstract and we're very busy.